thank you very much too for joining us. We're at the Social Market Foundation event dedicated to political philosophy in a pandemic, this new book of essays. And I'm delighted to say I've got with me, I'm Jesse Norman, I've got with me several of the authors of essays from this book, and we're going to hear from them, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas, and then we're going to throw it open to the audience to take any questions that you folks might have. And I hope you'll be very forthcoming with ideas and questions as part of the wider debate. This is a fascinating topic. I think we can all agree that the pandemic has forced us to a degree of moral reconsideration as to some of the most basic values that we might hold dear, and to question some of the assumptions that we might have entered this last 2 years fondly cherishing. And what should be the priority given to personal freedom, and is that in conflict with the priority that we give to individual lives and well-being and to public health? How has the pandemic shone a light on aspects of our society that perhaps have not been sufficiently attended to in our public debates? They might be issues of poverty or education or health, that might be. And so it's a very rich and interesting topic, and I'm delighted, and I thank the SMF for having the wit and the interest to try to think not just about the policy solutions, the policy questions, but also about some of the wider and deeper philosophical issues that those experiences that we've had and that those questions themselves raise. So I'm going to work from my right, physically rather than politically speaking, to my left, and therefore I'm going to invite Aveek Bhattacharya to say a few initial words. Aveek's the chief economist here at the SMF, and he's also co-editor of a work entitled Political Well, this work, I should say, and therefore commands your attention. Thank you, and over to you, Aveek.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jesse. So this book, which we've got in front of us, which you can get behind you from Jane in the back, this book originates from a blog that my co-editor, Faye Nyker, and I helped to run called Justice Everywhere. And the mission of Justice Everywhere is basically to get political philosophers to take the ideas of political philosophy and apply them to current events to show their relevance and applicability kind of beyond the seminar room. And so in spring of 2020, in the first few weeks of the pandemic, Faye and I looked around us and we saw experts and scholars in different disciplines, not just the epidemiologists, but public health experts, economists, mathematical modelers, all taking the tools of their respective trades and trying to help us grapple with this phenomenon that was sweeping the world and turning our lives upside down, the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the question that we asked ourselves was, well, what do political philosophers have to say about it? What can we contribute to this discussion? And so we tasked some of our contributors to the blog to write very short, reflective pieces, maybe about 500 words, no more, on different aspects of the pandemic. And those pieces were rich and interesting, and so we thought, let's get more people involved. So we now have a book of 20 different essays on different aspects of the pandemic, a bit longer, a bit more thought through. But the irony is that the answer to that initial question, I think certainly at the time we posed it, in the acute emergency phase of the pandemic, was actually probably political philosophers didn't have that much to say, because I think the challenges, at least initially, were primarily empirical challenges of trying to figure out what the virus was and how it worked, and technical challenges about kind of immediate responses, but not, for the most part, questions of value. I think Rebecca's contribution is maybe a bit of an exception to that rule. But what we found was, what our contributors were more interested in doing was looking at the continuity between the difficulties and challenges we faced prior to COVID, rather than seeing COVID as this fundamentally novel thing which had uprooted everything and was fundamentally different to what had gone before. And as editors, that was quite convenient, because we set out on this book worrying that the questions we were asking, the thoughts we were having, in the summer of 2020 might be entirely redundant by autumn, winter of 2021 when the book would finally land. But I actually think it's arriving at quite an appropriate time, because the challenges that we lay out, the stuff we talk about, the continuity that we see, the issues that political philosophers have been grappling with, robustness, the issues that COVID-19 is described has highlighted and exacerbated, I think are challenges that we are really grappling with now as we slowly, haltingly try and emerge from the pandemic. And so for that reason, I think it's a very good time to be having this discussion as we think about what sort of society do we want to have, how do we build back better, as the phrase goes. And the second reason why I think it's a particularly appropriate time for this book to land, which links to the other one of the book, is the idea running through it is that crisis often goes hand in hand with opportunity. And in some ways, that's quite an uncomfortable thought. The idea that despite all the suffering and hardship and death that we've experienced over the past year and a half or so, that something good might come out of that. But I think it is nonetheless true that the pandemic has expanded our sense of what we're capable of as a society or a polity, just by the scale of the response and the things we've done. It also highlights many of the difficulties and really kind of puts a spotlight on the things that we need to do. And I think, at least to some extent, it has created an appetite for change and a desire to make things anew. And I think it's a particularly appropriate time for this book to land, because it feels like all of those things, that sense of possibility, that appetite for change, seems to be kind of weakening month by month as we go back towards normal. And so the question I'd like you all to have in mind as you listen to the presentations and as we go into the further discussion is, how can we make the most of this moment of potential change before it evaporates and before we lose it? Thanks.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Aveek. And not the least of the merits of that excellent introduction was that Aveek's taken the question of timekeeping extremely seriously. You won't have noticed that, but he's had his phone ticking away very nicely, and I commend that as an example to everyone. Katie, you've been writing and thinking about housing in the context of the pandemic. Tell us about how your thinking and that of your co-authors has developed.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the chapter that I co-authored with Kimberly Brownlee from the University of British Columbia and David Jenkins from the University of Otago. And the topic of our chapter was adequate housing in a pandemic, and so we're particularly interested in thinking about the adequacy of housing in the context of the lockdowns that we experienced during the pandemic. And what we sort of said in this chapter, I guess we said two things. One was quite a kind of simple thing, but we think a very important thing. And this is that if you're going to be confined to your home, right, it really matters that, first of all, you have one. And secondly, that it's adequate, right? And we drew on a UN definition of adequacy to help us kind of flesh out that idea. The less sort of simple thing we said was that whether your housing is adequate is going to depend on whether you are confined in it, right? So we wanted to kind of explore the idea that your housing, having been adequate prior to a pandemic lockdown, might be kind of transformed into inadequate housing in the context of a pandemic lockdown. So I don't really have time to talk through both of those points, so I'm just going to say a little bit more about the first point. So I think we were kind of worried about the idea that people who are already in inadequate housing, when we get to the point of locking down, are going to experience kind of additional burdens compared to others during a lockdown period, right? So obviously the lockdown was burdensome in a number of different ways for everybody, but we might think it's particularly burdensome if you're already in housing that's inadequate and if you're going to be confined to that housing. So just a kind of couple of examples of this. I mean, we explore a few more in the chapter, but imagine, for instance, that you're living in overcrowded accommodation before we enter into a lockdown scenario, right? So there's lots of different different things that are troubling about overcrowded accommodation. But one thing we might think is troubling is that you lack social control, right? So one of the reasons why we might think housing is important is because it provides us with an important measure of social control, like we get to decide who gets to come into our homes or not. If you're in overcrowded accommodation, right, you're lacking that kind of social control in the way which we think might be really troubling, right? You have much more difficulty withdrawing from others in that situation. And now if we think, going into a lockdown context, it looks like your kind of social control is even more restricted. And that looks like it's really troubling, additional burden. Like you can't even leave your house now, right? Your ability to withdraw from others is really compromised. So that's one way in which, inadequacy in housing, I guess, prior to a lockdown situation leads to kind of additional burdens during a lockdown situation. And then another kind of obvious example is, imagine that you're living in housing that is kind of very poor quality, right? That is unsafe or unpleasant or damp and so on. And now we're going to go into the lockdown, right? You're confined to this housing. You have no means of escape. Again, it looks like compared to someone living in kind of decent housing, you're bearing additional burdens. And we might think that this is pretty kind of troubling. So I wanted to sort of connect that a little bit to the UK situation, and we kind of discussed a number of different countries in the chapter, but obviously in the UK going into the pandemic, it looked like we had a pretty kind of unsatisfactory housing situation in many respects, right? So I think we could say of the UK that people were in an inadequate housing situation before the pandemic, right? So we have not great security of tenure in this country. We have, plenty of people who are homeless, both in the sense of sleeping rough, but also, living in temporary accommodation, sofa surfing, and so on. We have a relatively high proportion of housing that isn't of a great quality. So I've got a little statistic here, right? 23% of privately rented housing stock and 12% of socially rented housing stock in England doesn't meet the government standard for the minimum quality of housing. And so I think, if we kind of reflect on the UK situation, we can see that there would have been kind of troubling additional burdens for people in lockdown as a consequence of their housing situation. Now, of course, there were kind of various things that the government kind of did to try and improve the housing situation of certain people, right? There were kind of measures taken against homelessness, there was a ban on eviction, but that kind of doesn't deal with like all the dimensions of housing adequacy that I've kind of mentioned. And so I think the kind of, in terms of like thinking of a more just future, right? I think one of the things that reflecting on the pandemic, on lockdowns and on adequate housing kind of tells us, right, is that we ought to be really concerned about housing adequacy. We obviously ought to be concerned about it independently of pandemics, but I think the pandemic has really kind of drawn our attention to the way in which, like in this kind of context, people are going to suffer more as a consequence of living in inadequate housing. And that's something we should be really troubled about. And it should be troubling to us that people kind of went into the pandemic already in inadequate housing, right? That's not something we should have paid more attention to, and we should now be paying more attention to. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Katie. I think if we just gather some thoughts for a second for the audience and for the online audience. So far, just from your two contributions, we've had a very interesting question about the expansion of, as it were, a sense of possibility and potentially also responsibility, individual leadership, civic leadership, the state, perhaps also the question whether and to what standards we should be holding individuals in the state accountable for the actions that they've taken during this period. We've had this very interesting question about whether being confined in your home causes, as it were, should cause a reappraisal of the standards to be applied to one's own life and to those in such an accommodation. And this fascinating idea of housing as it were, a means of control over one's own life and therefore the threat that comes under from a pandemic. Now, Rebecca, you've written one of the most philosophical parts of the book, and I congratulate you on that. And tell us about that and about your interests in transparency in government.
Okay, so I begin my chapter with a thought experiment, which is not unusual for a piece of philosophy, but it's a thought experiment that might seem unusually real, a bit like finding yourself at a railway point, lever in hand, whilst the train trolley pedals towards various different sets.
So it's supposed to be real, Rebecca.
And so it's a bit like that. I'm giving an example of another. Or holding a box that might contain a cat or a beetle, one of the philosopher's favourite animals. But my thought experiment, which seems I fear, unusually real, ask you to imagine yourself that you're in the middle of a deadly pandemic. It's quite hard, I know, but now little is known about this imaginary disease yet, but it's certain that coughs and sneezes transmit it. And then suddenly you hear this astonishing rumour from an excellent source, suggesting that the state had gained some reliable information a while back that wearing a mask, one of those things we face, not only significantly reduces your chance of catching the horrible disease, but also passing it on. Yet this information, it's a surprise to you after all, wasn't passed on to the public. You weren't told that the state had reliable new information about mask wearing, you weren't told what it was. You're probably angry. But my guess is that your anger might be tempered if you were to learn that the imaginary state had good reason for withholding that information. I mean, you probably wouldn't think it was okay if you learned it was for the personal profit of MPs. But you might possibly think it was okay, for instance, if it be to protect the mask supply for healthcare workers. I'll come back to that particular example later. But my aim in the chapter, rather than focusing on specific examples, is rather to set out a framework to determine generally which kinds of instance of state non-transparency can be deemed justifiable. Now, the context in which I do this is a rights-based liberal democratic account of the state. So if you're not one of those kinds of people, you're probably going to think what I'm saying is irrelevant. So I have to just put that out there in case you disagree with me about anything. So this is an account that includes an individual right held by societal members to be informed about important political matters, and on which, without that right, the value of other important rights, not least the right to political participation in any proper real sense, seems severely diminished. So I'm focusing on state transparency not because it brings about good results, although I personally believe it does, but as a precondition of the liberal democratic state. Nonetheless, however, it seems generally and reasonably, I think, accepted that there are certain times at which such a state cannot and should not be fully transparent. Most obviously, perhaps this might pertain to the release of facts about an urgent ongoing counter-terrorism operation. So my question is, what rules should be in place about situations in which, at least intuitively, it seems the state should not be fully transparent? And what about unexpected emergency situations, such as pandemics? Well, first, I contend that the state's general obligation to be transparent involves meeting reasonable thresholds related to accuracy, context, and publicity. There's more about that in the chapter. And as this obligation correlates with people's rights, as I've said, and rights should not be overridden, on my account at least, the obligation should not be compromised, even in times of emergency. I note that it's a general obligation, however, pertaining to general state behaviour, and there may be some particular temporary cases in which the state is justified in holding back a limited amount of information for a limited amount of time, as long as certain conditions are met. But what are these cases and conditions? Well, I argue that particular justified cases should be grounded in justifiable general practice. So they should be clear and well publicised, democratically deliberated, and morally justified general rules, both about the kinds of incidents that count as justifiable cases and the extent to which information can be withheld whilst and only whilst it's justified to do so. So crucial here is that recognising that being fully transparent about the fact that you're not being fully transparent about something is different from revealing the full content of that thing. So I contend there are two key considerations: ongoing transparency, that democratically deliberated, morally justified kind of transparency, and in the set of rules, and in the moment transparency. And ideally, both will be evident in any justifiable case. However, whilst the existence of various types of general awareness will form a necessary condition of any justifiable case, so you can't just suddenly come along, there's got to be stuff about the kind of thing about which has been democratically deliberated and morally justifiable. In certain instances, however, this will require supplementing with specific awareness for a sufficient condition of justifiability to be met. And while that specific awareness is necessary in some but not all cases, it's not a sufficient condition. So you can't just have, oh, by the way, here's a new rule. Beyond this, justified cases are by nature temporary. So any suppressed information must be fully released as soon as it's no longer justified to withhold it, reflecting normal practice. Now, it seems likely on my framework that standard justified cases will involve important serious matters such as necessary state action against a direct, immediate, and as far as possible, well-publicised threat to the life of citizens, for instance, during a moment in which detailed public knowledge of such action would, with as high a degree of certainty as possible, directly impede the state's reduction of that threat. But the cases say, coming to the final part of what I'm saying now, because I know I'm probably hitting the upper bound of your time limit, involving secrecy and manipulation to bring about unrevealed state aims, no matter how laudable those aims might seem, will not count as justified. So an obvious example of a non-justified case, for instance, regards, say, the non-disclosure of state contract tendering processes on the prediction, I think it'll actually be a bad prediction, that's a separate point, that in the long run the economy might benefit if the state built up secretive preferential relationships with certain companies. unjustified on my framework. Another example, however, to return to the beginning, would be if the state failed to inform the public that mask wearing was beneficial during a respiratory pandemic in order to try to prevent public consumption, reducing the supply of masks available to healthcare workers. It seems clear that in both of these cases, there could not be specific in-the-moment transparency about the state's reasoning and aims or its specific actions, and also that while somebody might try to argue that these kinds of cases could have been priorly determined via democratic deliberation as involving the kind of thing about which the state could be temporarily non-transparent, this certainly could not be the case in the mask wearing scenario, since A, well, in the thought experiment, you were surprised to have learned about the state's non-transparency. Yeah, that's a bit of a tricky answer, right? A tricky way to get around it. But B, more importantly, there are many things that democratic deliberation does not suffice to morally justify on a liberal democratic account. So rather, in both cases, the state is specifically depending on the public's lack of knowledge about its actions and reasoning in order to bring about unrevealed and unjustified aims. Not to suggest that the particular non-transparent actions described in these two cases could never be justified, if such actions were required temporarily to avoid certain threats, for instance, but rather that the reasons proffered in these particular cases do not suffice. So a final sentence, which is that I finish by turning to the question of disinformation, asking, what if it were not only that the state had failed to inform you about its newly acquired reliable information about the benefits of mask wearing, but what if it had also told you that wearing a mask would be detrimental to your health? I don't think it's just a thought experiment. I think this did happen during the pandemic. What then, I wonder, would be the appropriate public response to such behaviour? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Rebecca. Vast array of questions I'm sure will be occurring to our philosophically literate audience, their brains throbbing with SMF, encourage liberal democratic ideas. Jeff, over to you. You've written about social media. Tell us what your thinking was.
Great. So the title of my chapter was Coronavirus Misinformation, Social Media, and Freedom of Speech. And I'm sure all of us ran across misinformation about COVID-19 during the course of the pandemic. Some of the misinformation concerned the origins of the virus, as with the theory that it was manufactured in a lab by China as a biological weapon. Other misinformation we might have run across concerns various measures that reduce transmission, with many sources falsely claiming that we shouldn't wear masks, as Rebecca just alluded to, on the grounds of greater harm. Other misinformation concerned the appropriate treatment for COVID-19, with many prominent figures, including at the time the US and Brazilian presidents, falsely avowing that hydroxychloroquine, an antimalarial drug, effective treatment. And I think all of us remember the conspiracy theory concerning the lives in all of humanity. It was a particularly fun one. Now, I think misinformation about coronavirus has been objectionable for a number of reasons, but the most important reason is that it can lead to harm. It can lead people to harm themselves, making risky decisions that increase their exposure, or involve harmful self-medication. But I think misinformation has also risked leading people to harm others. In many cases, that occurred by assisting the virus's transmission, like failing to wear a mask. In other cases, I think misinformation has been dangerous on the grounds that it's inspired violence. So, for example, conspiracy theories alleging that the virus was a scam created to control citizens resulted in death threats against contact tracers. And we all have heard the horrible stories about the spikes in anti-Asian hate crime. Now, I think everyone agrees that something needed to be done to combat misinformation about coronavirus, but one of the more controversial suggestions was to insist that social media platforms take responsibility for combating this content on their networks, either by algorithmically demoting it, removing it, or engaging in its own form of counter speech by appending links to third-party fact checkers who debunk the misinformation. In the public debate, the suggestion that restricting coronavirus misinformation on social media was the right course of action led to a chorus of opposition from people who thought that this violated the freedom of speech. An op-ed in The Guardian by Cass Mudd summed up the sentiment nicely. "Don't let free speech be a casualty of coronavirus" was the title. And so what I tried to do in my chapter was take seriously the thought that actually repressing misinformation about the coronavirus is actually perfectly compatible with freedom of speech, properly understood. I argue that this is true especially when such efforts are voluntarily undertaken by the social networks themselves in response to public pressure, and indeed this is what happened in many cases. After not removing very much content at all, we've now seen aggressive campaigns across the main social networks to take some substantial action against coronavirus misinformation. But I think this kind of effort would be acceptable even if legally mandated by the state. And the reason I argue is that not to impose undue risks of harm on others. That's why I think the right to free speech doesn't protect terrorist incitement or incitement to engage in other forms of criminal activity, why it doesn't protect incitement to racial and religious hatred. And this, too, I think, is a category of unprotected speech, speech that constitutes seriously harmful misinformation, or, when knowing, disinformation. So I argue in the chapter that when users post harmful misinformation, they violate this duty not to endanger others through their speech, even if they do so unintentionally. Accordingly, those who endanger others by posting misinformation are not wronged when their posts are removed. If you post misinformation about the coronavirus on social media and the social media company removed your post and you complained that your free speech rights were being violated, I think that's a mistake. Your free speech rights were not being violated because your free speech right never protected that kind of dangerous speech in the first place. Now, that doesn't mean that just flat out removing posts is the right response in all cases. In some cases, leaving content up, posting links to trusted third-party fact checkers is going to be the right response. In other cases, merely slowing the spread of the misinformation through algorithmic demotion is going to be the right response. But I think which exact technique we ought to use is largely a technocratic question about what's going to be more effective in response to our increasingly improved empirical evidence about this, our increasing empirical evidence about this issue. As a matter of principle, I argue in the chapter that there really is nothing wrong with taking aggressive action against this category of dangerous speech on social media. All options are on the table, morally speaking. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed to everyone. And if I tell you it's under the, which is 3 minutes longer than 25 minutes, which is 5 minutes each, but 2 minutes shorter than 6 minutes each, I think you'll agree that's a masterful act of collective self-restraint. So thank you very much indeed. Some very interesting questions. I hope the audience will be forthcoming with their thoughts and queries. But I would like to just pick out something just coming out of everyone has had interesting things to say, has already picked up, but just picking up the last two contributions, obviously, the question of whether the state could ever be justified in withholding information, and also, as it were, the question of under what circumstances it's appropriate to publish or to allow state and non-state actors, which was in some respects counterpart questions to each other. So I suppose the question I want to have for you, if I may, Rebecca, is the question, imagine we are in one of the scenarios that you're describing and the state is withholding information. Can you just, you were playing with the distinction, it sounded to me like, between telling people you're withholding information as being, as it were, acceptable according to the moral framework you laid out and were arguing for, and then not telling them. And so one question is, well, hold on a sec. Is option A actually a real option in a world governed by norms of transparency, social media, the Freedom of Information Act, and the rest of it? I mean, isn't it really just, isn't telling people we're withholding some stuff just really a way of saying, come and get me, and by the way, when you do it, my credibility, my state authority, perhaps some of the fragile belief in the state that is quite a crucial source of social capital in the pandemic, that would lose that. How justify that distinction for me, if you would?
Okay, so one thing I say, and I think one of the reasons I've been very disappointed by a lot of state behaviour over the past 2 years, not just in this country but other countries too. So I think I'm a believer in relatively minimal state, but one thing I think is super important state obligation is to be a reliable source of information. So yeah, obviously in the modern world, people are bombarded with information from all kinds, and it may well be the case that if the state doesn't say something, someone else is going to say something. But I think.
Right, so if we go to the state and we say, are you withholding anything, you think the state should say yes?
So sorry. I was just more kind of just a point around your point about different sources of information coming, so it may not even matter if the state doesn't say something. But no, I think the distinction I'm trying to make is between me having a secret and telling you I've got a secret and me telling you what my secret is. And what I'm saying is that I think there are many instances in which the state could say, look, we have some information, but we're not going to tell you it. They could say, we have some information about X and we're not going to tell you. Say, we have some information about this kind, Y kind about X, and we're not going to tell you it. And the the kinds of scenarios in which that could happen could be predetermined, they're democratically deliberated. So, for instance, a democratic society could say, hey, during counter-terrorist operations, it will be the case that this kind of information doesn't have to be relayed immediately. However, that's not going to justify keeping it away forever. So, for instance, all this stuff about, the royal family stuff being hidden for 73,000 years, I personally just think that's crazy. I mean, I don't think having a royal family is justifiable on the liberal democratic account anyway, but do you see what I mean? I think we can do a much better job of this. And yeah, of course, there are going to be some grey areas, but what I'm trying to do is set out some general kinds of rules on which there's general practice and then the specific practice.
So there are categories which we would all accept that somehow revealing the names of agents in the field might be a problem. Another one might be what you might call commercially confidential information. Those things are kind of established categories. Yes, okay. Does anyone want to come in on any of these questions from the team? Otherwise, I'm prodding a little bit in this area. Aveek, you've got a man. You look like you've got a thought or two.
Oh, no, happy to move on.
Okay. Let's just push a little bit then. In a way, what I want to ask Jeff and indeed all of you is: were there any results of your theory that conflicted with your intuitions? Or was the perfection of your theory such that it explained all your intuitions and nothing, and as it were, didn't conflict with any of them? Because I think it's quite a helpful test. I mean, what I'm really hoping is that you'll say, actually, I really thought this information ought to be published, and then I realised, in reflecting on my moral framework, that actually really should be published. I don't know, Rebecca, whether those, or Jeff, whether you felt that any of your intuitions were being conflicted with by the.
Absolutely. So I'm intuitively skeptical about any effort by the state or any powerful actor to interfere in people's communications. And so I think, given the history of free speech repression, we should all have that kind of skepticism. But I do think that skepticism has hardened in some quarters into a kind of unhelpful orthodoxy, whereby any attempt to restrict harmful speech is met, not any attempt, but most attempts are met with resistance. And I think that orthodoxy finds expression, for example, in the free speech theory endorsed by the US Supreme Court and many prominent American liberal philosophers. But I share the intuitive starting point. But once I started to think more deeply about these questions, it just occurred to me that even though we should have that skepticism, I don't think it follows through in all cases. And I think that we can justify restrictions on various forms of dangerous speech. That doesn't mean I'm not still worried at the end of the day. So I think authoritarian regimes around the globe are very keen to emulate legislation that restricts misinformation and use it to their political advantage. And so it's very important, and this is something that legislators in this country in designing the currently debated online safety bill are keenly aware of, to set up a mechanism for dealing with various forms of harmful content, such that it's properly insulated from political pressure. But I think it's something we always need to keep our eye on.
I'm not going to ask you where you think we should be on the issue of publishing or non-publishing online. But so just to as it were, would it be a fair view of your position, Jeff, to say that we parse it as follow? I am a naturally private person. You have secrets. They are repressing.
I don't think I followed. Can you
what
have
I mean
another go at it?
What I mean is that where you come out in terms of thinking about the suppression of information can be a very context-dependent matter, right? So, and one of the aspects that you seem to be gesturing towards, which is this extremely liberal individualist idea that somehow to have any secrets at all is impermissible, and possibly personally impermissible as well as impermissible in the state. And then you have a view that says, well, actually, we have things like privacy, kind of in a way, some of Rebecca's concerns. We have perfectly proper boundaries which we need to respect, and that the state should be respecting. And we can't always tell by a general theory whether it's going to work out in the right way, and therefore we kind of need a more heterogeneous theory.
I think that
kind of getting towards.
Absolutely, I think that's right. And I think that also explains why it would be a mistake to craft a statute that banned misinformation or disinformation simpliciter. It's always going to be an intervention in a particular context in response to some ongoing situation. I mean, it is striking, going back to the online safety bill, that it is being designed with an eye toward future-proofing, so that Secretary of State and Ofcom have the mechanisms at their disposal to react to ever-changing situations. And there's a balance to be struck between the nimbleness and flexibility on the one hand and democratic accountability on the other, and making sure that democratic polity is involved in specifying the categories of speech that may be permissibly suppressed. You wouldn't want to give Ofcom, and the legislation doesn't give Ofcom, not quite, the power to just decide what counts as disinformation and then implement it at whim. And I do think that connects to the kind of balance that needs to be struck in Rebecca's paper as well.
So, and I'll ask one more question and open it up to the floor. It's really to Aveek and Katie, which is, as you think about the performance of the state, and you think about the way in which people reacted individually through the pandemic and through lockdown, and of course the heroism in some cases and the non-heroism in others, do you feel a sense of renewed faith in individual energies? Do you feel a sense that the state has proved to be a more successful actor than you had thought? Do you think that as it were, economically we've ended up, there is an argument, isn't there? We're slightly away from philosophy, but there's an argument that actually are much better than anyone thought. There was a moment where it looked like the economy was going to be washed away by the reaction, and it's turned out not to be the case.
I think it's a very complicated question in that I don't know what my all things considered take is, because it feels like there's some ways in which there were some very drastic failures, and as you say, there were some pretty striking successes that we maybe wouldn't have predicted in March 2020. I think certainly around macroeconomic management, around the success of the social safety net, as well as the kind of obviously the obvious things around vaccines, which are really apparent. So I don't know what my overall view of state capacity is as to whether we're ahead or whether we're behind. But I think that the big takeaway, the thing that I alluded to right at the start, was that I think it's shown that a lot of things are possible. There's a lot, kind of the scale of action is potentially greater than we might have imagined. And I think a lot of the things that failed, to some extent, you can have the excuse of this was happening very quickly in real time, made on the hoof. But that capacity to fundamentally, to freeze the economy and pay the wages for a huge proportion of people in the country, gives us a sense of the scale of interventions that a government pointed in the right direction can make. And so I think that's the thing to take away. And that isn't unique to the pandemic. We see this, the incredible social changes that occur every time we have war, for example. But it's a useful reminder of that.
Yes. Katie?
Yeah, well, I thought it was sort of great that issues of sort of homelessness and the security of tenure were suddenly being taken much more seriously, and I guess that housing was suddenly, it seemed like, at the forefront of people's minds in the way that perhaps it hasn't been, even though it should have been. And I think my hope would be that would kind of continue to be the case, right? And I suppose it would be worrying if some of the kind of extra action that was taken with regards to housing was, stopped being taken eventually, which possibly we're seeing a little bit at the moment. So yeah, it was really great that there was a kind of what I would view as an appropriate response to a really serious sort of normative issue. And yeah, the hope is that would kind of...
Well, and also certainly qualitatively different response, right? Because the argument historically, a lot of it's about sources of new housing, rather than the state of the housing stock we have and its relation to forms of life.
Yeah, and also I think a real focus on home ownership, right? And can we get more people into home ownership and not so much concern about, well, what about all these people renting, and do they have, secure tenure, and do they have damp and mold, I think. Right. So yeah.
Okay, brilliant. So later on, we've got 20 minutes, and I don't know whether we have the capacity to take online questions. I'm looking at the SMF team, but let's start from the gentleman on the left.
Thanks. Will Snell from the Fairness Foundation, which is about to exist. Question, I don't know, this may be in the book, apologies if it is, any reflections on whether and how political philosophy can help us to navigate this debate given new prominence by the pandemic around health inequality, and the debate broadly between the kind of structural interpretation, social determinants of health, etc., and the more individual responsibility denoted by the focus on health disparity rather than inequalities.
Right, so structural components and then what you might call health disparities.
Structural. Can we get around that sort of false binary perhaps?
Is that new, just coming into being
Freshly minted.
foundation about which we'll be hearing massive amounts.
Absolutely.
How very exciting. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, who wants to pick up those very interesting questions? Aveek, why don't you have a shot?
And because I would urge you to please buy the book or get your help to order the copy.
And by the way, intergenerational fairness, health, I mean, there's a whole raft of fascinating topics addressed in here, which we barely have a chance to touch.
Yeah, you don't have to go very far. You just have to skip over my bit and get to chapter 2. Essentially, the second chapter.
It's too far. Sorry, yeah.
Jonathan Wolff and Avner Deschamps address fundamentally that question, and I think they do see it as a bit of a false binary. I think they probably lean on the side of the social determinant, but they describe, they have a theory of disadvantage, and they basically apply that to COVID-19. What that does very well is it draws out the ways in which structural forms of disadvantage condition your ability to make individual choices. So the stakes are raised, for example, or you have to take on risks that you otherwise wouldn't have to do. So yes, have a read of that for more detail, but it is definitely covered in the book.
Yes, and that reflects the process of some thinking that Joe and Avner have been doing for 20 years. I mean, it's very interesting, long before the compounding effects of different aspects of one's social, economic, personal situation had really begun to be understood. So full credit to them. Anyone else want to talk about healthcare issues? It's not really any of the things. Perhaps we can refer you to the collection. Okay, who's got another question? Yes, sir, in the back. You, sir.
So a question about the size of the state. So if we're going to take it as a given that the state's got bigger, at least temporarily, during the pandemic, and that it's unprecedented levels of intervention in people's day-to-day lives, do you think that should give us cause to reflect on the kind of adequacy of the democratic principles and structures that underpin the state? If the state has got bigger, do we think that should mean that we should reflect on how democracy functions? For example, should we be looking at a democratic way of reflecting on the government performance during the pandemic, for example?
Right, very interesting. So by, for example, a series of by-elections or something like that. Okay, good. Rebecca, you've got, you look like somebody might want to figure that out. He says, offering you a cool slot. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess when I think about these kind of issues, I like to make a distinction between like what might be justified on a kind of democratic account, or what might be what the kind of conditions of democracy are, and how that might manifest itself in or be manifested in a society. So I think, for instance, it's not inconsistent to say, I don't know, our democratic processes are rubbish and need improving, but that democracy is a great thing and that we should try to have a democracy. So yeah, I totally think that there are all the time, and particularly this pandemic has shown up lots of ways in which we need to improve our processes. I think there are quite good arguments that many countries that people think are democratic aren't democratic. So for instance, I think you can't have a democracy unless everyone has a particular rights to political participation, such that I actually don't think the UK is a democracy before women have a vote. That's quite a controversial thing to say, but I genuinely hold that.
So you move that so fast. I don't think you quite got that, Rebecca. Let's just put that on the table so we can just see.
So what I'm saying is, I think there, if you're talking about democracy, you want to think about what the conditions of democracy are. So, for instance, I've got quite a high bar on what I think counts as a democracy. I think a democracy entails having particular political rights to democratic participation. That doesn't just mean voting; it means being involved in the process in much more some
rights to be involved
ways,
in these other ways.
Right. So I think a political society in which all members of the society don't have those rights isn't a democracy. Now, loads of people are going to disagree with me about that, but I think that's an important debate to have. I think a secondary debate is to have in a country that is classed by people to be a democracy, or one that is even on my high bar account a democracy, the way in which you then manifest that in a good way. So we need to find out what those ways are in which those political rights are going to be respected, what the obligations are of those people who represent the state, etc. So in terms of whether the state is big or not, to my mind, I think that may be a kind of largely a second order question. In that you can democratically deliberate, hey, we'll have more taxation, we'll have more government departments, we'll have more of this, more of that. Sorry, it's a bit of a kind of a sort of unfair way of describing it. Do you see what I mean? I think those are separate. I want to make a distinction.
Let me put a question back to, in a way, the audience or indeed the panel, which is, has what we've seen here been a kind of ratchet, which says if the state gets bigger, and everyone thinks, oh, that's rather marvelous, a bit of extra dough I wasn't expecting. And then actually people really like that. And since the people who are paying for it are their children or grandchildren, you don't have adequate capacity within or safeguards within a democratic structure to look out for, protect the interests of those other people who will be paying for it. And therefore, you do have an inherent impulse. This is a traditional criticism, as you will know, in classical philosophy of that democracy basically consists of giving people a lot more of what they want, and you will never break out of it, and eventually the whole thing disintegrates. Is there a risk of that? Are we seeing any of that in the context of the pandemic? Anyone think?
I mean, I think in the context of a moral emergency, of course, it makes sense to it's justified to increase expenditure in this way. But I think it's a perfectly valid point that concerns of intergenerational justice need to be taken very seriously. And you could completely imagine a current generation spending beyond what they owe to future generations. You could also imagine a current generation not spending enough with regard to what they owe to future generations. I'm thinking now about the expenditure we need to engage in to
So let me just turn the screw a little more. Let me turn the screw a little more on the question, just to get a little traction here, which is, so let's consider that we might have a different situation here from that in a war, right? Because what happens in a war is you get a massive investment in productive capacity, right? That industrialization, that capacity then becomes something that can boost economic growth coming out of war. That's what we saw in Germany, that's what we saw in Japan, America, this country to some extent. And of course, what you then did get were extreme gains in productivity coming out of automation, industrialization. Now we haven't seen that. We've seen sustaining people's incomes rather than industrial investment by and large. And we've seen it in a context of very modest productivity growth. Does that not mean that we should have stronger safeguards against impoverishing future generations than the ones we have at the moment? Sir, in the back.
I wanted to dispute your account.
Excellent.
Comparing war with COVID. Firstly, in this, I think it's not strictly true that in the war you saw just a net increase in industrial capacity. Of course, you also saw a massive decrease in industrial capacity from carpet bombing. And the industrial miracles in Japan and Germany took place in decades after the war, after the 1960s, and not really based on
because of investment.
Because of investment by the hegemon of the United States after the war, not because of investment during the war, is my sort of, from a non-historian, what I'm characterising what's happened. I therefore think it's probably too early to say, well, there was no productivity growth in the 2010s, therefore COVID has had no effect on productivity. We're seeing massive changes in the way we're working, we can work from home, better adoption of various technologies, which means that between now and 2040, which is the equivalent of the time of the economic miracle in Germany and Japan, we might see massive changes. So I think maybe that lesson isn't one we can quite draw.
I'm sure you're right. It does look as though there may have been a negative effect on productivity from COVID as people withdraw their respect. I absolutely do. Aveek, far away.
Can I come back to you, Beck, on this? Because I think the risk in some ways might be the opposite one to the one that you presented, which is, I think in some ways the greater risk might be of what appears responsibility might end up being fatalism. And the question of what COVID is going to do to productivity is still an open one. I think there's certainly some people reading the tea leaves and seeing some gains in productivity. For example, in, say, the shift towards home working. And in some ways the worry might be, if we go back to normal, if we junk the kind of the opportunities and scope for progress that we've seen over the last year and a half, it might be worse for our children and grandchildren.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I'm so sorry.
I wanted to respond to what the original questioner said about, because you said, oh, the state's getting bigger in the sense of interfering more in our lives, right? And I suppose like some of those ways are obviously ones that we don't want to continue, like the disruption to our freedom of association involved in the lockdown. It looks like that was an expansion in state interference in our lives that is troubling and should be kind of withdrawn as quickly as possible, right? And then there's worries, I guess, about forms of surveillance associated with like tracking us because of, which seem kind of justified, but again, like you sort of suggested like a democratic response for some sort of careful monitoring of that, and kind of perhaps like some democratic control over that might be something that we would want.
Okay, brilliant. Does anyone else, before we get back to questions, want to pick any of these themes up from the panel? Okay, in that case, I'm very interested in non-male questions. We haven't had many, in fact, we haven't had any of them so far. But until that moment arises, I'm going to pick on the blushing young man at the back who runs the Social Market Foundation.
I'm tempted to say, more of a speech than a question as well. A question about...
I'll take another question.
A question about vaccines and markets. And we're all bringing this very happily, we're meeting in person because of vaccines. If it wasn't the vaccine, we wouldn't be here, we would be on the streets of. And those vaccines have largely been developed and provided by private companies operating markets. So the question, I'll keep it relatively broad, is what lesson do you take from the development and distribution of vaccines for the interaction of markets and morality? And if you'd like a more precise question, is it right for the makers of vaccines, academic others, to make a profit from the sale of those vaccines now?
Right, okay, I don't know if anyone got that, but we were talking vaccines, vaccination, the interaction between private companies and the state through the vaccination rollout, and then the question of to what extent it is acceptable, morally permissible for a vaccine company to make a profit out of selling vaccines in a pandemic. Anyone want to pick that up from the team?
Yeah, I mean, I think your point about distribution brings me to my answer, which is that the market can often be the best or the most efficient way of allocating goods, and that there can be morally justifiable ways in which that's done, and it can also be beneficial in the sense of efficiency. But the efficiency isn't the only important moral value in the state, or indeed in any group, because it's probably hard to think about morality because there's just only one person there. So I think as long as we recognise that, and we also recognise the importance of limits and conditionality, I really like Jeff's point earlier when he was talking about misinformation and the right to freedom of speech. I think oftentimes people want to talk about these things like conflicts of rights or balancing rights. I really dislike that because I think it takes away from the important thing that a right is. It protects something because it's something that can't be overridden. Whereas if we think about limits and conditionality, whether that's just around rights, whether that's more generally around the kinds of ways in which values interact, then I think we can get a broader and a broader kind of philosophical position on something which otherwise might seem either really narrow-minded, like efficiency is the only value. I mean, Aveek is a big Bentham fan, so he's going to be hating everything I'm saying. But I just don't think that efficiency can be a sole justification for any kind of action in a good moral society.
So we can't have any Bentham fans in this organisation. What on earth's going on?
You've got a super fan here.
Have we? Okay.
Not me.
Would anyone else like to come in on these quite crucial issues?
I have something to say, not necessarily in defence of Bentham. The thing I want to say is, having tried to take an afternoon off as a philosopher, you're bringing it back to economics, because I think taking pharmaceuticals as a paradigmatic example of the market, when it is a very, very odd sort of market, it's driven, and the market that we were talking about is one where you're mainly selling to states. So I'm just not really sure.
I'm just taking the hard cases. Yes.
I'm just not I'm just not sure there are general lessons there. I think it's just so unusual.
Does anyone want to comment on that? Well, let me say something, and I should, in the interest of full disclosure, disclose that my wife ran the vaccine task force, so I had a certain amount of insight into this. And I would say two things. I think that it was extraordinary how the state required the ingenuity of medical, scientific, industrial, manufacturing, operational experts to come into the vaccine task force in order to drive that process of selection. And if you think there were, 150 odd potential candidates out there, to get it down to a long list and then to choose the 7 candidates that turned out to be ones that worked at a time when ex ante no one thought any vaccine had more than a 15% chance, or even in general have a more than 15% chance of developing a vaccine in the foreseeable future, and when they typically take 5 to 10 years, is a miracle. and extraordinarily brilliant. I would say it's written a piece of work. On the state side, no less brilliant was the organization of the vaccination program and the decision to go in cohorts, beginning with the most vulnerable, because that created a rolling expectation about getting vaccinated, which meant very high levels of vaccination rates all the way through. So I think it's a really remarkable case study of how the two sides can work. And anyone who thinks state good, private bad, needs to reflect that that is completely refuted by this. And anyone who thinks private good, state bad, needs to accept that their view is refuted by that. Listen, one other thing, it's not generally remembered that AstraZeneca, in partnering with Oxford and developing that vaccine, a vaccine which has, I think I'm right in saying, now been administered over 2 billion times and has done 20% or more of the global need. For a very long period of time, they did that at cost. And I don't think anyone's understood that. And I think I'm right in saying they were the only major company that did it at cost. So credit where credit's due, however one comes out of the philosophy, those are at least the facts of the situation. Okay, we've got 3 minutes. And I'm in the market for a final question. I think my desire for gender balance is likely to be thwarted and frustrated. And nevertheless, I'm very happy to call the gentleman. Oh yes, ma'am, young lady, fantastic.
Aveek, earlier you talked about how we can take this moment of the expansion of opportunity for change. And you also just spoke about the importance of partnerships between private and public. I'm just wondering if there are any other key policy areas that you think that could benefit from in this moment of change, that kind of partnership, perhaps housing.
Such a good question.
I was going to go
No,
Katie. Any other areas where, let me think about public and private for a second.
Where public and private can work more closely and more effectively together, or more felicitously together.
Really controversial to healthcare.
Well, suddenly, we haven't got enough
more generally.
months to debate that. Rebecca, Jeff.
I mean, just on the topic that I spoke about, I think we're seeing the prospect of very productive cooperation between the regulator, Ofcom in this country, and the social media companies. And I think that kind of situation where there is cooperation between public and private on identifying the categories of online content that are objectionable and that do need to be removed will be central to thinking about how we redesign social media in a way that can support a healthy democracy rather than undermine it.
I mean, many of the companies we're talking about either have multinational or more supranational type power or supranational type influence. So those kinds of, as it were, jostling togethers between states and private corporations is about to become, I suspect, inevitable in many different areas. I don't want to miss out that final question from Jeremy.
This is a kind of a technocratic issue, so if you don't answer, I understand. But should we change the approach we use about misinformation? Let's say if the president spreads misinformation, let's say someone standing outside Westminster, like a speaker, or should we use the same approach to tackle misinformation for everyone?
I mean, my view is I'm skeptical of a kind of newsworthiness exception for public officials. I think we should have content moderation standards applied even-handedly across the board. If something is truly dangerous, I don't think there's some kind of immunity that's conferred simply by being a public official.
So it should be possible to sue on grounds of breach of law officials in public office, even if they're, as it were, saying things that people merely find what? I mean, are you allowing? Is there a misinformation law that you're proposing to sue a public official on?
So I'm not thinking of it in terms of liability. I'm thinking of it in terms of the platform's rules about various forms of harmful information. And the thought
there's no carve out for someone who's in a senior public position.
Exactly.
Okay.
I'd just say, I think, and this comes back to actually a question you asked earlier around, I think, whether secrecy is a bad thing. I don't think holding secrets per se is a bad thing. I mean, it might be morally bad in the sense of, I think what I'm trying to say is, I think that if I don't want to tell people about my hygiene routine in the morning, I think that's absolutely fine. I don't think per se secrecy itself is a bad thing in that sense. It's perfectly fine for me to have thoughts I don't share with people. But there are different standards, I think, acceptably for different people in public life. There are special obligations particularly people hold, particularly if they're acting ex officio. So to that end, I don't think it should be the case that, for instance, if I say to my friend something which another person might fairly count as misinformation, I certainly don't think that should be, depending on the particular situation. I think it's unlikely on my kind of position that's going to be something I think should also be counted as legally wrong as well as maybe morally wrong. But in terms of a public official holder saying something, saying something which might be exactly the same thing, I'm sure I would probably have some slightly different views, maybe not completely different views, but slightly different views around the legal situation, because I do think there are special obligations held by people who hold particular roles public roles in a democratic society.
I mean, it's worth just saying before I thank all of our guests that certainly in a parliamentary standpoint, there are things you can do and things you can't do, which go over and above the normal laws in the country. Right? So you can say things that are potentially libelous inside the chamber of the House of Commons, or that would be potentially libelous outside. With that goes a responsibility, which has not always been discharged. And then there are other things you can't do. So you can't call someone a hypocrite in the House of Commons. And slightly more seriously, it's very bad form for politicians, especially a minister, to comment on legal proceedings. And yet that, I'm afraid, is also a bit done from time to time. So there are normative and, as it were, non-legally enforced rules that do constrain public debate, at least in this country, in ways that have evolved over time, both, as it were, more liberally and less liberally. Okay, we've kind of run out of time. I promised us a soft landing. I hope it's been a fun ride as well as a soft landing for everyone in the room and online. I very much thank our excellent speakers today, Jeff Howard, Rebecca Lowe, Katie Wells, and Aveek Bhattacharya. I encourage everyone virtually and in person to rush out and lay in copies of this masterwork, Political Philosophy in a Pandemic, and explore all the other areas we haven't discussed today. And I know that it will be a thoroughly fulfilling and worthwhile experience. So with a final thanks to James and the Social Market Foundation, let's end it there. Thank you very much indeed.